My name is Nathan Mosley, and I'll be going over the Physiology 461 Exam 2, Question 1, questions about the muscle system. So here we have kind of a schematic of the sarcomere, which includes thick myosin filaments and thin actin filaments. And actin kind of has this arrangement where there's a nebulin protein that has a series of kind of circular G-actin proteins, and then woven through those G-actin proteins are troponin proteins. And then kind of on the ends to differentiate each sarcomere is the troponin. Sorry, the screen is the tropomyosin. I read that wrong, my bad. And then we have the troponin. Troponin has three parts and plays a really important role in how the muscle contracts. Just in that movement that I did with my arm, it required a series of muscle contractions to occur in different muscles. And troponin, what it does is it, through a pretty intense biochemical process, kind of has a head that kind of forms a right angle, if you will. And what it will do is it will latch onto the thick filament, the myosin, and it will latch on and kind of pull, kind of like you can imagine like a steampunk machine doing in some ways. And it will hit, pull, and then have to release, which takes ATP, and then it will have to biochemically change its conformation, and so it will be what we call cocked and then uncocked. And so it will cock itself by having ATP in there. It will kind of punch up and grab onto the myosin, pull itself, and then through the use of ATP going into that, it will go into its more energetically, higher energetically stable conformation of uncocked. And then by removing the ADP and the inorganic phosphate, will uncock itself again. And this allows it to pull on myosin again, doing this continual motion. And so that's how we get our muscles to contract. And these contractions are, copied and pasted all across this, and they're able to bring the two ends of the muscle, the origin and the insertion, closer together. Just like how my bicep originates up on my shoulder and inserts into the forearm, it's able to contract and bring with it the rest of the limb. So that explains how the sarcomere could mechanically contract, but how does it physically contract? It requires calcium. And so there's a thing called the sarcomere and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum has access to calcium and a channel called a T-tubule. And that T-tubule will have calcium flow through it and kind of distill and disperse across the muscle fibers, where calcium can interact with the G-actin and allow for that contraction. So moving on, muscles take different energy sources, and some of that is the ATP that we just have in our muscle cells at that time, and that only lasts for about 5 to 15 seconds. And then we can move on to burning the creatine phosphate that we have, which gives us more access to phosphate ions that we can allow ATP and ADP to interact and produce more ATP, so that constant pattern can occur of the cocking and uncocking of the of the troponin on the myosin to occur, which we call the power stroke, by the way. So we can get that constant power stroke from creatine, but that only gives us about a minute of energy as well. And so other than that, we have to go into anaerobic exercise, anaerobic glycolysis, and the Krebs cycle and things like that, stuff that we don't really want to talk about, but we can if we need to. And then there's two types of muscles. This is a very good explanation and schematic for skeletal muscle. A lot of that happens, but in skeletal muscle, which like my bicep I mentioned. But really we have two types of muscle. We have skeletal muscle, which helps us move our appendages and our head and spine and everything like that. And then we have smooth muscle, which includes cardiac muscle, and those things help move things like our esophagus and our intestines and our heart, obviously, cardiac muscle. Although cardiac muscle is kind of a weird in-between between smooth and skeletal muscle because it does actually contract, but it's kind of because of its autonomic nervous innervation. It's kind of a weird thing. We call it usually a third different type. But smooth muscle is really interesting because it can be two types. It could be a single unit, which means it's kind of stacked on top of each other like this, where there would be a muscle cell and then another muscle cell and so on and so forth, and they can kind of move in waves that are they act as like a single unit. And that's where we get things like peristalsis, so how we swallow, or how our intestines move food that we're digesting along. And then we can also have multi-unit types of smooth muscle where things are more fractionated. And the truth is that smooth muscle doesn't really deal in absolutes. It's not a Sith. It will often incorporate many different types of these single unit or multi-unit types of muscle into it. And so moving on, I mean, it's really interesting. Smooth and skeletal muscle will they have very long biochemical pathways of how they work and interact. Smooth muscle, for instance, will interact with calcium will be released, and then a calmodulin protein will incorporate ATP, kind of double the ATP that it actually needs. One to do the actual energetic processes, and then one to phosphorylate what it needs to do with that. And then that will activate what's called the myosin light chain kinase, which is an enzyme that incorporates myosin, and it will break down, or it will actually allow myosin and actin to link up. And again, it's a very complicated biochemical thing, but that myosin light chain kinase is inhibited by another thing called the myosin light chain phosphorokinase. And so if you have an increased amount of myosin light chain phosphorokinase, you're going to actually not get a lot of smooth muscle contraction. Now, there's another thing called rho kinase, which is an enzyme again, and it will inhibit the myosin light chain phosphorokinase. And so if you have an increased amount of rho kinase, you're actually going to get a more tonic or sustained contraction versus a non-tonic contraction, which has its own name. And then the thing is, though, is that if there's all this rho kinase, we're actually getting this sustained contraction. We're actually not using a lot of calcium from inside the cell. We're actually having to reach outside the cell to get that calcium. And so that causes the extracellular calcium to increase, which tends to shut off the rho kinase. Essentially, if I'm holding a tonic pose and I'm constantly flexing my arm, I'm going to get weak and fail eventually. And so that tends to happen with smooth muscle, where holding that smooth muscle taut, right, and contracted is going to lead to failure eventually. And so with that extracellular calcium being incorporated, that's actually going to decrease the rho kinase available, which will increase the myosin light chain phosphorokinase, which will decrease the myosin light chain kinase. And it's pretty complicated, but that's kind of how smooth muscle works versus the simple skeletal muscle, which just requires ATP. And whether it gets that ATP from the ATP stores found in the cell, or creatine, or aerobic metabolism, where it's just able to produce ATP through glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, it's able to maintain a contraction because it's constantly getting the troponin to go from that uncocked to that cocked conformational phase, and then when it's able to be cocked, it's able to grab onto the myosin and pull. And so that's pretty interesting, I think. But yeah, so in muscles, we're going to have different sensory organs. They're smaller organs, they're not like the liver or anything like that, but they are specialized cells that are going to tell us about the position of our body. And so we have these things called muscle spindles, which they allow for us to have reflexes that we would normally not have if we didn't have them. And what the muscle spindles do is the opposite of what a Golgi tendon organ does. And I'd explain the Golgi tendon organ much like this. If I were to hand you something that is way too heavy for you, you would instantly grab onto it and drop it. And that's a reflex to help preserve your muscles and your health. And what the Golgi tendon organ is doing is it's recognizing that immediately there is too much strain on the muscle, so just give up. And so that will allow us to just drop those things. And so that's called an inhibitory pathway, where we want to be preserved in that, and so we will not attempt to lift that object or that thing. And so those Golgi tendon organs are really important especially like in the gym and things like that. And the muscle spindles do the opposite. They take on weight, and they realize that there is a reason to hold it, that there is a stretch mechanism that they can hold that weight. And that's how we get things like the knee-jerk reflex, where there's a slight stimulus to the tendon of the quadricep muscle, and it says, okay, we're going to, in fact, contract because there is that stimulus, and we have no reason to like drop it, for instance. And that comes in with a thing called inhibition of the opposite side, where, for instance, if you have the knee-jerk reflex, your quadricep is pulling and sticking out your knee, and then your hamstrings are actually relaxing and allowing that to happen. In fact, if we had both of those things on each limb, the flexor and the extensor on each limb, trying to pull at the same time, we would immediately get a tear in our muscle. And so the muscle spindles and the Golgi tendon organs are able to kind of prevent the tearing from both muscles trying to contract at the same time, but also prevent the tearing of one muscle from contracting when it shouldn't, and then also not contracting when it should. So we kind of cover a type 1 and type 2 error in that sense. And then with that, we also have a stretch versus withdrawal reflex. And so the stretch reflex, as I mentioned before, would be like the muscle spindle. We also have withdrawal reflexes where if we were to step on something sharp, like a Lego, the foot that encounters the sharp pain will react and pull away from it, and then the opposite side will plant further into the ground, for instance, where we don't want to hurt ourselves by falling completely and crumpling to the ground, but we also need to get away from the sharp thing that we stepped on and plant our other side even further into the ground as stability. So that's kind of a brief rundown of how the muscle system works. And yeah.